again, we're talking about gardening misinformation tonight. So to start off, I'm just going to do a couple definitions. So misinformation, something that gets thrown around a lot, right? Especially nowadays, I feel like it's something we hear a lot with, AI online and, worries about false information and a lot of topics. So misinformation refers to false or inaccurate information. Disinformation is false or inaccurate information that is deliberately intended to mislead. So, misinformation might not always be purposeful, but it is important to be aware of and to be really sort of vigilant about because it can cause a lot of harm to individuals or communities in a variety of ways. So, a lot of people tend to think of misinformation as being a pretty serious topic, right? We think of it as having a pretty significant consequence in fields like politics, health, medicine, safety, these kind of serious topics. So, a lot of people think that why would we worry about it in the field of gardening? Because, maybe it's not quite as heavy or the consequences don't seem as serious. Misinformation in the garden, it could lead a home gardener to feel disheartened with their garden, maybe uninterested or alienated from their garden because they're not getting results that they want. But in the field of horticulture, it could lead to significant consequences, right? It could lead to things like decreased food availability, damaged agricultural livelihood, bodily harm from dangerous tools or pesticides, or unwanted health effects. I mean, there's a lot of these things that are pretty intertwined in our daily life that misinformation could be very serious. So why do we see so much gardening misinformation? I'm sure, as this webinar was advertised, hopefully it stuck out to some of you that sometimes you have a question about a plant that you're growing and you go online to search for some help and you just end up either way overwhelmed with the amount of information that you see or confused, or you try six things and nothing really works and just kind of feels like this crazy vortex of stuff, right? So, one thing that's interesting with the gardening and horticulture is there are a lot of sort of cultural things that, at least in the United States here, it does seem like the science isn't prioritized with gardening. So I have a couple papers cited here. One is a paper that for a long time, gardening was seen as an extension of the home. So it was women's work. So it wasn't treated as a serious field. Similarly, on the US Census Bureau in 1930, farm laborers were categorized as unskilled. So some people think that gardening and agriculture is not a skilled labor. And so why would we really care about something like science that goes along with it? There is a lot of study about urbanization and how we are becoming more and more removed from interacting with plants in our daily lives. So some people necessarily don't think of them as mattering, right? So they might not care that much about what the science is involving. And then this last paper is actually about small farm communities in Tanzania and how because of they might have lack of access to extension resources like us at CCE Westchester, they might be lacking digital devices to help them find better information or unbiased organizations that can actually help them find reliable information. So they end up relying on word of mouth, which things can get lost along the way. Like I said, misinformation isn't always on purpose. But also it's very complicated, right? So our relationship with nature and plants is very multifaceted. Things like nature and the outdoors, we might have spiritual or religious connections. There's certainly a lot of historical and agricultural practices that are very important to cultures. There are health benefits of being outside and interacting with plants. And a lot of times being outside in nature represents our connection with other people, right? Social activities. And aside from that, so if that weren't complicated enough, our relationship to food is just as complex, right? We have food is often crucial to, again, spiritual well being, happiness, culture. With food, growing food, cooking, or baking, those could be something you do for fun or for work. So those can be really important parts of our lives. And obviously, food is necessary for life, right? We all do need to eat. And so sometimes with all these deeply emotional and social connections with our plants, nature, food, it feels like hard sciences might be at odds with that. Some people don't necessarily feel like they think about those aspects when these plants, these crops, they represent something different to them. So some of that misinformation we commonly see in gardening. So it's common with a lot of science that you get misapplication of science or a general misunderstanding of what science is saying. It's common just because not everyone is going to have the background to approach the science. A lot of times with gardening, we have outdated information or confusing anecdotes with proven science. So, again, it's common to have a lot of word of mouth spread. So, maybe something has been disproven or isn't really quite the right way to do things anymore, but people just kind of keep believing in these things, or even they just have an experience that they say, well, it worked for me, so it works for everyone, but it's not really the same thing. Commonly, you get a lot of attributing human characteristics and logic to plants and pests. Not the worst thing in the world to do, but it's important to know that scientifically, these plants and animals and things aren't reacting to the world in the way that humans do. They don't have the same nervous system as us. We see a lot of movie magic with gardening and a lot of exaggerated timelines. I think that's a big culprit a lot of the times because people promise you're going to have everything in your garden in this short window. Not quite the case. So the thing is, at the end of the day, gardening can mean whatever you want it to mean. It can represent whatever it is that you want it to represent in your life. But horticultural science is real and can and should be integrated into whatever approach you take or whatever relationship you have with gardening, wherever it can be. So, seeing through misinformation is important, right? So, we've talked a little bit about misinformation in gardening, but we want to be able to assess the quality of information that we see, right? So a big one, especially with online search, right? This is kind of everyone's go-to nowadays. We have these supercomputers in our pockets. So it's really important to understand the purpose or sponsor of a website when you're looking at it, because that might tell you what that information is there to do. So .gov websites, that is a United States government agency. Most governments of other countries will have their own specific ending. So .gov is government in the United States. .edu websites are an educational institution like a college, school, or university. .org websites are typically nonprofit organizations like research groups or advocacy groups, but some for-profit organizations may use this ending as well. .com websites, com is a great way to remember commercial. So most of the time you're going to see things like business, news magazines, and sponsored content through .com websites. And .net websites are open to the public for use. So this is important to think because while some of these, backings may have more research, right? An EDU website might have a lot more research coming out of an educational institution. And a .com website, maybe they have people paying money to either sell an idea or a person or a product. So when you compare two different types of information from those sites, it's really important to know who is making that information and why. So some really great things when you're looking for information online, you want to check that the site has reliable authors, sources, or experts interviewed. So somebody writing a news article might not have all the expertise about a topic that you might want, but if they're interviewing experts, you can still trust that as being a reliable source because they're talking to someone who knows all that we need to know, right? So even if it's not the author who's the expert, as long as we have good sources within the article, it can be very trustworthy. You want to check the age of information. So some topics are really well researched and don't change super frequently, whereas some might be evolving rapidly. My example for people is maybe the feeding habits of a ladybug has been studied, and we don't necessarily expect that to change very rapidly. But something like climate science is changing very rapidly, so a lot of that data might be outdated very quickly. If a claim seems too good to be true, it probably is. A lot of times when people are saying that there's some magic fix or some easy thing, they could be selling something or just an exaggeration for any purpose. Check where the information is coming from. This is really important with plants. So a website from the UK or from California, they might have very, very different plant information based on the different environments they have. It's too warm, too cold. Maybe they have a completely different set of animal species and plant species that grow there. It's really important to know where the information's coming from. And then not all science is created equal. So some scientific sources might be outdated, proven wrong, financed and influenced by companies or corporations, or are not reviewed by peers or able to be replicated. So an important thing when it comes to science is we have a lot of people who peer review papers. They can replicate all sorts of the experiments being done so that we can come to a consensus on how something works. A really famous example of maybe not quite ideal science is the famous experiment of playing music to get plants to grow. It was an experiment that they said if you play classical music for a plant, it's going to grow better than if you play, I think it was hard rock music. Um, that was an experiment that a lot of people tried to replicate, and no one was ever quite able to get the same results from. So, a fun idea, and their experiment, their evidence did come to a help them come to a conclusion, but overall not the most reliable science because it doesn't really qualify in terms of widely accepted and widely replicable. This is a great list of misinformation red flags. So again, it's always good to be looking at the source of a material to understand if it's trustworthy, but these are good things to keep an eye out for too. So speaking in absolutes, fear mongering, sounding too good to be true, like I mentioned, using unnecessarily long words to alienate people. So this would be like saying, "Oh, you guys should all beware of this chemical I found called dihydrogen monoxide." That's a chemical term for water, but some people might hear that and get a little freaked out, right? So you're using these long words to make people confused on purpose. Representing a function that does not actually exist or offering to solve a problem that you don't have. Selling themselves, right? They're there to sell what they do or their research or their product. Lacking credentials, self contradicting, no sources cited, cherry picking of science or other sources, and pushing to disbelieve others, especially experts in the field. So, this is a great way that if you're noticing any of these things in a source, that it might not be the most reliable information. And if that's the case, not necessarily something you have to write off right away. You could maybe look into the source and see if it was a one off. Maybe you can check through sources to see if there was just a misunderstanding somewhere. A lot of times when you encounter misinformation, the best thing to do is just do a little bit more research, right? See if you can figure out if this isn't true, what is true, and why might that thing not be true. This is one of my favorite ones to share with people. So, tools for fighting misinformation. This is actually a test that came out of a state university in California called the CRAP test. So, some librarians came up with this. It stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So, these are all the things I've kind of talked about already, right? Is it current information? Is it relevant to you? Who made it? Why did they make it? And is it even accurate or correct? So that's an easy one to remember. If you're reading through something, it can be applied to books, websites, any of your sources. Talking about quality sources, as extension, right? These are all sources that we not only encourage people to use, but we use ourselves. So I'm saying this that these are all websites I go on a regular basis. So along the right side of the screen, you're seeing a lot of extension websites. So I will say North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. That one is great, very helpful. Basically, every garden manual you've ever found, but online. So you can search for plants and it will give you like every bit of information about those plants. As for those extension sites that are listed, for the most part, they are states that are close by to New York. So I know that those are probably going to consider or contain a lot of the information that's accurate to my environment here in Westchester. Maybe it's accurate to our seasons or the plants that grow here. You might see on the bottom there, this University of Minnesota extension. While that's very far away, they have some really great online resources. And because their growing zone is colder than us, a lot of their information does still apply to how we can garden, not vice versa, right? They couldn't necessarily use ours, but it does still apply. And our environments aren't that different. I also have on here like the Department of the Environmental Conservation in New York. They have some really awesome fact sheets and especially information about things like invasive plants, invasive diseases, forest health, some really cool specialty topics. Over on the left side, that little blue icon is for Google Scholar, which is actually a source where you can search just scientific papers. So that can be really helpful if you're looking for specifically scientific resources. Above that is a website called Retraction Watch that actually keeps an eye on papers, scientific papers that might be retracted for some reason or another. So that can be really helpful if you're trying to make sure that your scientific source is totally sound. And then above it, I do want to talk about, you'll see there's some Cornell resources on the bottom, but up in that top left corner, there's something called Ask Extension. So this is actually a public forum website that goes between extensions all over the country. I caution people with it because it is a forum. So it's not necessarily the 100% top most accurate at all times, but it is a really great jumping off point. So if you end up Googling something, you end up on Ask Extension, it might not give you the right answer, but it might give you an idea of what is happening or where to look next. So that one can definitely come in handy. For the most part, looking at all of these are going to be things that are research based. So we're really listening to people who are actually out doing the research. It's a lot of land grant universities, just like Cornell, so places that focus on extension work. And then also just a lot of local or regional institutions that can help you to find the most accurate information when it comes to gardening. So let's say I'm having this problem and I go out to my yard and I say, okay, I see a culprit on my tree. This fuzzy growth, this might be a bug, it might be fungus, I'm not really sure. If I just Google white stuff on my tree, I'm probably not going to find what I want. Maybe on the off chance I find exactly this and I can figure out what it is, that's going to be amazing. But with how many things pop up when you type into Google, it's not likely. So rather, you can search something like white fuzz on apple tree and then add site.edu at the end. So if you include that phrase site.edu, what that tells Google is to put your edu results on the top of the search. So all of the results are going to be prioritized edu to the top. So that can be really helpful. And if we get more specific with our search terms, we're more likely to find the thing that we need. So here I see some damage on my plant, but I don't necessarily know what caused it, right? That could be a fungal disease, or it maybe could be an insect, or honestly, it could have been anything. So rather than saying brown spots on leaf, maybe I say pests and diseases of mint, site.edu, because I know that it could be something, but I don't know what. So like I said, you add that ending to your search priority or your search to prioritize those websites. You can do site.any ending to get a prioritization. And you can also do minus or dash com or minus dash net. You do have to make sure that that minus or that dash, there are no spaces between that ending, but that can help to take those results out of your search as well. So that can make sure that you're just being more specific with what you search. So I have a couple case studies where we're going to look at truth and fiction on social media because I think, yeah, maybe if I'm going out and I'm searching about garden information, maybe I might be a little bit more discerning on what's true and what's not. But I think it's pretty easy to be sort of hoodwinked by people and posts and videos that come up online, especially on social media. Because for the most part, I think a lot of us are scrolling on there without using our brain. So the first case study, we have a viral post shared without context or accurate information. So this is a meme that I've actually seen. This is in here because it came up on my own uh, feed. This came up algorithmically to me. So it says progress after 1 year converting a water-dependent lawn to 70 species of mostly native plants, Ontario. So the top picture is 2022, bottom picture is 2023. So you don't necessarily have to come into the chat for this, but I did want to have people just look at this and think, what is this telling us? What message is this conveying? And what do we actually see in the photo? So, what I see when I read this, so it says 1 year converting a water dependent lawn to species of mostly native plants. What sticks out to me about that caption is water dependent lawn and native plants. So, what it seems to be telling me is that a water dependent lawn is a bad thing, and picked a new thing, which is native plants, that is not water dependent, and that's a good thing. Looking at the photo though, I will say in the top photo, it clearly is winter, if not maybe early spring, whereas the bottom photo is summer. So of course that top photo is going to look way less lush and green and beautiful. And then looking at the bottom photo, I am a horticulturalist, so I looked at that bottom photo and said, I can see a lot of plants in that photo that aren't native plants. And if anything, that bottom photo looks way more water dependent to me because there are a lot of flowers, there's a lot of vegetables in there. I'm just not sure if I totally believe that caption. So I actually found this post online. I went and I searched it until I found the man who actually posted it. So he is a man in Ontario in Zone 6B. He shared this post of his yard to social media, and he describes that he had to dig several feet into and then remove all of the rocky soil that was below his grass. He installed drip irrigation throughout his whole yard, and he was planting primarily for pollinators. And while he does mention a few native plants, the garden that he was planting was never meant to be a native garden. It was meant to be a pollinator garden. So he really was prioritizing things like flowers. So none of that is necessarily against what the caption says, but I do think we've sort of missed the mark on what he was trying to do when he was sharing his information. And it does feel to me like this post is trying to push maybe we don't want to have a lawn, or maybe native plants are better, or this is what everyone should do because look how easy it was for him to go from this to this in a year, right? It just feels like there's something that doesn't quite capture what actually the guy was posting about. So here's a couple more pictures. You can see a couple more angles. And these many paragraphs were him describing plants that he had in his yard. So some of the things he mentioned could technically be native plants, but there are a lot of varieties that are non-native. So everything underlined in red are the only things I could verify were native plants that he posted. So again, they said mostly native plants. I wouldn't call that mostly native. So it's the kind of thing that is it misinformation? Yeah, it's false or inaccurate. Is it disinformation? Probably not. But it is just something that, again, this came up on my own feed. My alarm bells kind of went off because I thought that doesn't quite seem right. That seems like maybe someone is trying to make a statement with these photos, as opposed to this gentleman who was just really excited to show off his beautiful garden. Some also might notice that there was a fire hydrant. I will say he posted a lot of apology posts after he put these photos up saying, I know there's a fire hydrant, I'll make sure it's unblocked. That wasn't necessarily part of the focus, but but yeah, so again, just trying to kind of understand what these posts are maybe evoking in people to understand why they might be captioned or describing something in a certain way. And then I have this clip here. This is movie magic. So this is a clip, again, this has gone viral. I even, before I started, I'll ask the question, how many views do you think this has on social media? And again, just thinking, what is the purpose of clips like this? Why are they appealing to viewers? Why would this video be made and shared? And do any of these ideas even make any sense? So on my next slide, I do break down some of these, but I can do that live with the video just because, we have a chat feature. I don't need to make everyone chime in. So we're putting a plant into a banana. Aloes are desert plants, so they do not want really nutrient-rich soil like that, and probably they would rot with that banana. Put some carrot scraps in water to grow them. So there's a good chance we would get greens, but there's no way to regrow the root, which is the part we eat. So unless you're doing that for maybe a pet, I'm not sure why you'd want to. So we're cooking an eggplant, but then we're saving the seeds out of it, it's very possible that we nuked those seeds and they're not going to be worth growing. Um, the egg shell is also unnecessary. This is my favorite one, actually, the ginger. So it says place in a sunny area. That's it. We don't get to know what the ginger turned into. So mushroom coffee ground growing is a thing, but the mushrooms that we eat are fruit. And they're not fruit like we get from the store or off the shelf. They do not have the proper reproductive structures in them. So you can't just break them up into coffee grounds. That won't grow them. Not sure why you'd need rice water. That seems a little unnecessary. This one I talk about on the next slide. I have some pictures. So we're taking out some kiwi seeds and we're watering them. This is great. You totally can do this. Suddenly we go from sapling to a full tree with fruit on it. It looks like the same kind of thing. We save some pomegranate seeds. It says 20 to 25 days. We have a pomegranate. Seems a little unlikely to me. So that had 75 million views. So again, what is the purpose of something like this? It's movie magic, right? It's entertainment. It's to get people to say that looks so fun and so great. But don't you think someone will be disappointed when they save their pomegranate seeds and 25 days later they have maybe a tiny sapling, let alone, not a tree with fruit? When it comes to do these ideas even make any sense? Maybe some of them do, right? You can absolutely take seeds out of a kiwi and grow a kiwi from it, but some of the other ones, they're just a little bit silly. So here's, like I said, I have a breakdown of some of those clips, and then I have this picture here of that corn. So you actually can do this with corn, and this is what it looks like. So you can get those kernels to actually sprout and put out roots. But the thing that you might notice about this picture here, if you look from the top to the bottom, that corn cob does not change. And it looks to me like those sprouts were stuck in between the openings. So if you go back and forth, look up and down, those don't appear to be coming out of the corn cob. So again, it begs the question of why? Because if we can actually do this experiment and show what it looks like, what's the point in faking it? Maybe it's faster and easier for them as a channel to put that up, but that's the kind of misinformation that ends up causing trouble in gardening because you're showing everyone that, see, this is exactly what happens. And then when they go and try and things get a little crazy, a little different, it can really confuse people. And it kind of makes the institution look a little bad, right? When we can't guarantee what our growing experiments are going to look like, people get really confused and alienated, and it's hard to bring people back on track. So then the rest of this, we're going to focus a little bit on garden myths. So busting kind of the common garden myths. This section is going to be very info heavy. Feel free to put your questions in the chat while I cover this. And then, like I said, these are going to be things that are covered in that bibliography. So if you want to learn more, absolutely check that out so you can figure out some more information. But this is basically, we're just going to run down some of the most common things that I tend to see when I'm online and running into things that aren't quite accurate, and what the truth really is. So here's a really great example. We have anthropomorphizing, which is plants as personal pest repellent. So plants in their whole parts are not pest repellents. Plant oils are, but those aren't something that you can necessarily get from a living, growing plant, nor are they something that can be volatilized and released into the air from a plant. So plant oils must be processed from tissue and concentrated, and then usually those plant oil concentrates aren't safe to be applied onto skin. So even if we were to get some kind of mosquito repellent power from a plant oil, it's not something we can spray onto our skin like a DEET. A fun fact I have is that citronella geraniums, or the citronella plant people often put in their gardens, they actually only contain 0.09% citronella oil, which is the oil concentrate that has been found to have some pest repellent properties. Another one with that volatilization is that scents are not repellents. So in this picture here on the side, this is it starts off by saying ants dislike the smell of peppermint. I'm not sure we can really say that ants like or dislike any smells. They also have a very different olfactory system than to us. So when we are saying that we're smelling a fruit or a flower or a something, the way that that ant is processing the chemical input of a smell, entirely different to us. So not only is that often not scientifically accurate, but it's also just it's anthropomorphizing, and we end up saying, well, I smell a strong smell from this plant, so that means an insect will, which is often not true. And then just the last thing too, the plant oil repellents often show either low efficacy and or short pest repellent protection. So some of the most effective plant oil repellents have only been found to offer protection for something like 60 to 90 minutes at a time, whereas some other pest repellent products might end up offering things like 4 to 6 hours. So, there's not like there's no benefit to these plant repellent oils or these pest repellent oils from plants because there are a lot of benefits. Rosemary oil is very, very commonly used agriculturally. So, I mean, there are a lot of benefits, but it's just important to know that just because you have a plant next to you on your table while you work in the backyard, it's not really going to be the thing that dissuades insects. Companion planting is our next one. So now before people panic, companion planting as a whole is not pseudoscience. A lot of companion planting information online are from either outdated and now disproven science or anecdotal. In general, though, if it's worked for you, it works, right? If you've done something in your garden for years and you've noticed good results, there's no reason for you to stop. It's really unlikely for plants to be allelopathic, which means they actively hurt each other's growth while they grow. It's really not very common. So, if you have something that's worked for you, feel free to keep doing it. But it's important to think critically about those companion plant claims. If you're growing a tall stalk next to a vine and it says, oh, the vine can climb up the stalk, that makes perfect sense, right? But this one that I cited here, it says multiple papers, scientific papers that I was tracking down claim that basil repels tomato hornworm. And this is maybe something some of you home gardeners have heard before. The thing that stuck out to me is I said, does that even make sense? Because basil oils are not things that are commonly used as a pesticide product in really any scenario. Would intercropping basil as a whole plant, not an oil application, actually help if the oil is the thing that's doing the pest repellent, right? Um, like it could make sense. Sometimes people use trap plants where they draw the bugs to that plant on purpose, but in a lot of cases, it didn't really seem like that made sense to me. But as I tracked it down, nearly every paper that cited that basil repels tomato hornworm is citing the same 2004 study with an anonymous author that has now been removed from all corners of the internet. So I was able to find the organization that published it, and there was no evidence of this paper existing. So it's a word of mouth kind of thing, right? Well, somebody said, and then somebody else said, and then somebody else said. But when you really track down the evidence, it's not there. And then the big one also that I have on here is marigolds. That's kind of everyone's favorite go-to companion plant that I feel like I've heard. In research, marigolds have been proven to have nematocidal properties towards very specific kinds of soil nematodes, which are microscopic worms that can damage root systems. But they have only been shown to have those properties and no other insecticidal or repellent products or properties. So again, sometimes people choose to plant those because they think or they know that in their yard the bunnies eat the marigolds on purpose and then they leave other plants alone, or the insects attack that. They use it as what's called a trap plant. And again, if you're finding success using those marigolds in your yard for whatever reason, keep doing it. But scientifically, that research just isn't there, or that evidence isn't there. They've done the research and really there's no evidence to show that that's something that can be used for an insect repellent. And that's that I have in the corner there. That's a good example of like a misapplied science or anecdotes because we're kind of confusing those anecdotes with true science, or we're mixing up the science, right? We're saying, well, if marigolds kill nematodes, they kill everything. So, fertilizer, I have this labeled in the corner as too much of a good thing, and it's a little bit of anthropomorphizing as well. So, fertilizer is often called plant food, but thinking of it as something to feed the plant is a pretty wrong way to think of it, I would say. So plants are uptaking mineral nutrients to complete complex chemical processes in their cells, but they also are producing complex chemical food and nutrients and sugars in their cells. And so when it comes to what they actually need from us and that they can't get from the environment, it's very, very complicated and very, very minute. And in a lot of cases, we kind of end up doing too much. So most soils do have enough stable sources of nutrients for established plants to grow. So that would be things like perennials, trees, shrubs, anything that's growing over and over again. It is really unlikely that they're going to need fertilizer unless there is a specific instance. So, like trees, they rarely require fertilizer of any kind due to their root systems. In significant cases of very specific diagnosed diseases, fertilizers can be helpful, but for the most part, they're going to cause more good than bad, or more bad than good. Plants can't endlessly uptake nutrients, so the more we add, we're not necessarily going to just keep getting good results out of them. You might lead to plant health problems, you might get runoff or environmental pollution problems. And the thing is we don't necessarily know. We can't look at soil and know how much of nitrogen or boron or molybdenum is in the soil. So that's where soil tests come in handy. So really anything that you're planting that you want to know what you're going to have to do to take care of those plants, soil tests are a great way to do that. So getting the soil tested to know what nutrients are currently available, and then most nutrient soil tests often will give you recommendations as well on if you're trying to grow tomatoes in this yard, here's what you should do throughout the rest of the season to make sure they grow and are fed and everything else we need, right? So soil testing is kind of always the answer when it comes to fertilization. Before you put anything down, know what's going on in the soil. Soil amendments, on the other hand, can also get very tricky because soil is a very complicated ecosystem. So things, a lot of times people add things to their yard that are not needed. Soil amendments like sand, gypsum, pebbles, or other types of amendments, they cannot actually change the texture of soil. For a long time, people say if you mix this into your garden, you're going to have better drainage. In theory, you might add some more air pockets, but soil texture is defined by microscopic soil aggregates. So sand cannot affect clay soil. It will just be clay soil with sand mixed in. Lime is something people often add to their lawns, especially. It should never be added on a regular basis because it can greatly affect the acidity levels of the soil to the point that it can be out of range and not be brought back in range under 10 years even. It's a very slow process. So it's fast to mess up the pH and really hard to fix. So definitely not something that needs to be added regularly. Um, I kind of against the other argument with that is that a lot of mulch products are touted to really change soil makeup, which is not really true. A lot of that has been proven incorrect. And so most organic mulches do positively impact the soil without affecting things like acidity levels. And then a really common thing that we see is people adding so much organic material to their lawn, healthy or not even lawn, their gardens, their yard spaces. Healthy soil actually only has 3 to 5% of organic material. So that might be compost, it might be broken down leaves, twigs, sticks, anything coming from the environment. Um, it also could include organic fertilizer options. So, some people use things like, crushed up marine animals. Those are still organic matters. And if you have too much organic matter in soil, you can get excessive salt buildup. You can actually lead to anaerobic conditions where soil becomes without oxygen, and actually really poor drainage because again, that organic material does not allow for a lot of movement of air, of water or air. So you definitely, if you're adding a lot to your yard, you want to be adding topsoil as opposed to straight compost because it's really hard to diffuse when you have solely or even too much of that organic material. Speaking of organic though, different kind of organic, there's a myth of organic labeling. So this is actually a table here from Michigan State University that talks about organic labeling. So when it comes to labeling, these are legal labels. So to put these on their products, any company that's producing food does have to actually follow these legal requirements. But the important thing to know is that organic does not mean pesticide free. It means that the pesticides used are organic certified. So anything that is organic is using organic certified pesticides. Um, there is also different things like you see on here that made with organic ingredients or specific organic ingredients that if not all 100% of the ingredients are certified organic. And then, this is organic under the USDA. It's important to know that things like all natural, non GMO, cage free, some of these other labels you see on products are not regulated. So while these are something under the USDA, those are not something that is being tracked by any sort of organization. So this can be really mislabeling or misleading to people because they're trying to understand the labeling and it's telling them a lot of different things. And it's really important to know that there are definitions to some of these words. Speaking of GMOs, this is a really commonly misapplied or misunderstood scientific content or idea. GMO stands for genetically modified organism, and technically, if you ever hand pollinate two plants in your backyard, you're genetically modifying that plant because you are specifically altering the way that it's growing or the way that it's reproducing to get something that you want. So GMOs are often modified to have something desirable about it. So golden rice is a common one. It was modified to contain more nutrients so that communities struggling with food insecurity could get more nutrients from a smaller amount of food. Um, the process of federal FDA approval for these foods is extensive. It's usually between 10 and 20 years. So when they are on the market, they are highly studied and extremely safe. They have gone through extensive testing, extensive background checking to make sure that they are completely safe. And actually, interestingly, in 2022, there was a change that federally required that GMOs now are labeled as bioengineered or derived from bioengineering. Just because, again, GMO being genetically modified, it could mean so many different things. So, it's just important to know that a lot of times they're very well researched and very, very safe. So this is a common idea. So a lot of people say that native plants are the best plants ever. And while it is true, native plants have so many benefits. They're so important to the ecosystems around them, to insects, to animals. They're very, very important, but they're not perfect, right? So I mean, pokeweed and poison ivy and even black walnuts, those are all native plants, even though they definitely all have their own undesirable aspects. Native plants can still be aggressive in your garden. They can still cause trouble. And unfortunately, this is why this is labeled as outdated science. Our native ecosystems are changing very quickly right now. So while a plant might be native to this area, they might not be doing well in our changing climate right now. They also, in the world, there's just no plant that is native to an urban environment. We haven't had urban environments the way we have for long enough in human history that there's no plant that's comfortably adapted to things like urban heat islands and road salts and the things that come along with being in an urban environment. And then it's important to know too that some of our highly prized species are not native. So honeybees are not native to the United States. They're a European species and actually can be considered invasive when they're not in managed colonies. And then another one, people, I love to bring this one up, is tomatoes aren't native to Italy. I know we think of tomatoes as being such an Italian food staple, but tomatoes are native to South America. So, obviously non-native plants do still have value in our ecosystems. And it's just important to know that while things are changing, it's really great to have native plants around, but it's important to be flexible and understand that in some situations we might need to accept non-native plants into our ecosystem for benefits that might help us in the long run. And then it's also just curious, a lot of people tend to call native plants, or at least what I've seen in the industry, native plants are considered to be plants pre or around 1492. But there have been global transportation of plants for thousands and thousands of years. There have been European presences in northern North America as far back as 1000 CE. And then even pre 1492, there were an estimated 50 million people living in the Americas practicing agrarian lifestyles that were using the land. So sometimes people get nitpicky about what's a native plant, and it can be complicated on its own. So again, it's just important to be flexible with what is native, because sometimes we're going to get benefits from non-native plants. And it's important to know that they could potentially all help us in the long run. So some tree myths. This is another one we see, just a lot of people kind of misunderstanding some things about trees. So my favorite one is that actually majority of tree roots sit between 6 to 18 inches below the soil. So we tend to think of trees as tall as they grow tall, as root deep as their roots grow, but they actually tend to grow 2 to 3 times the height of the tree outward in the top 18 inches of soil. So they don't actually tend to grow very deep, which makes sense if you think about how compacted, how lacking in oxygen, and how close to bedrock the further you get down into the soil. Like I mentioned as well, trees often don't need fertilization. Aside from very specific circumstances, like I said, certain diseases might be warranted. And trees, often when they're put in the ground, they do benefit from regular watering, but after they're established, they may not really ever need water except for an extreme drought. Some people feel good about watering their plants. It feels like they're doing something, but most trees can find their own water because, again, they have a very large root system. Tree pruning wounds. Hopefully, this is something people know. It's just been falling out of fashion for years, but tree pruning wounds should never be painted. Wounds need oxygen to heal, so it's hard for them to heal when they're covered. And then mushrooms, holes, separating bark, and cracks generally represent health problems that cannot be solved and could pose serious risk in trees. So while one mushroom doesn't mean your tree's going to fall tomorrow, it's important to know that symptoms like that often represent tree rot that does not have a cure. So it's something that, if you're seeing some of these serious symptoms, you might want to bring in an arborist. And then this is my last one we're going to talk about. This is a great example of retracted studies, like I mentioned earlier. So no mow May, probably something a lot of you have heard of as home gardeners, but it was a citizen science experiment that was proposed in the United Kingdom for homeowners to go out and check their lawns, that if they don't mow for the month of May, what might grow there? Are they expecting to see a lot of flowers? Maybe they'll get more pollinators. Right off the bat, they released a list of, I believe, 25 species of flowers they expected to see growing in United Kingdom lawns. 19 of those plants are on invasive species lists in the United States. So right out the gate, a lot of their experimental framework is not applicable to the United States just based on their environment, right? We don't have these plants. We don't want these plants. But also, most of the United Kingdom, especially like London, is in zones 9 to 10, whereas Westchester is a zone 7. So they have a much different growing environment. So May in their lawn is going to be a very different time of year than May in our lawns. So it got some popularity in the United States, and in 2020, a study was released showing an increase of bee species on unmowed lawns in the United States. Unfortunately, though, this paper was retracted. So there were issues with the data in this paper, and it really went against a lot of scientific research that had already been done and ended up being retracted. So we know from extensive research that lawn pollinator populations are actually highest when when lawns are mowed every 2 weeks. Unmanaged lawns contribute to invasive species issues and actually increased pollution runoff from unmanaged lawns. The limited pool of flowering lawn plants that we have in the US, like things like clover and dandelions, generally aren't very beneficial to our local pollinators, anyways. A lot of them are invasive, and those local pollinators don't thrive from the imported plants. And again, peak season in May here, you could get 12 to 14 inches of grass growth within the month of May, which could smother any other plants on your lawn. Could become impossible to mow, could break your mower. And then even if you do get to mow, it could cause the grass to die after you do mow because you would be shocked from the amount that it lost. So again, this is an example of a retracted study. Obviously, we didn't know about the data issues right away, so no, not to say anyone was wrong to believe the study when it came out, but it is something to be aware of that when it was retracted, that's time for us to understand that, how do we actually really understand this issue specific to our environment and, what's actually some of the best practices moving forward. So that is my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have. I'm happy to give you back these last 5 minutes for your night. And thank you so much all for coming and listening. Um, we're so happy you guys could have all join us. Thank you. Lots of great feedback. That's awesome.